The meeting place was a small human station called Waypoint 7. It floated in the empty space between territories, far from any world or major trade route. There were no defenses here, no weapons, just a simple structure with a few rooms and a docking bay large enough for 2 ships. Kate Morrison arrived first. She wore simple clothes without any marks of rank or status. This was not an official meeting between governments. This was a conversation between 2 people who needed to understand each other. Counselor Zethrak arrived an hour later in a small transport with no escort. He had left his ceremonial robes behind and wore only plain traveling garments. When he stepped off his ship, Kate was waiting for him at the airlock. They looked at each other for a long moment. Then Kate extended her hand in the human gesture of greeting. Zethrak hesitated only briefly before reaching out with one of his 4 arms and accepting it. "Thank you for coming," Kate said. "Thank you for agreeing to see me." They walked together through the quiet corridors of the station until they reached a small room with 2 chairs and a window that looked out at the stars. They sat facing each other with nothing between them but empty space and the weight of everything that had happened. "I have been reading the archives," Zethrak said. "The real ones. The ones that show what actually happens in a civilization, not what we tell ourselves happens. Do you know what I found?" Kate waited in silence. Humans. Everywhere I looked, I found humans doing work that no one else would do. Fixing things. Healing people. Protecting trade routes. Settling disputes. 1,000 tasks every day that kept everything running smoothly. He paused and his 4 eyes looked directly into hers. "We never noticed. We took credit for stability that your people created, and we never even noticed." "That was never the point," Kate said quietly. "We did not do those things to be noticed. We did them because they needed to be done." "I know. That is what makes it worse." Zethrak's voice was heavy with something that might have been shame. "You wanted to help us. You genuinely wanted to be partners. And we treated you like servants who should be grateful for the chance to serve. Why? That is what I never understood. Why did you fear us so much?" Zethrak was silent for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Because you grew so fast. In 200 years, you went from barely achieving space travel to rivaling species that had been starfaring for millennia. Every decade, you became more capable, more essential, more integrated into everything that mattered." He made a gesture that might have been a shrug. "The restrictions were never really about containing your expansion. They were about slowing your rise. We were afraid that if we did not act, you would eventually replace us." Kate considered this. "And now? Now I see that we were fools. You never wanted to replace anyone. You just wanted to belong." He leaned forward in his chair. "Ambassador Morrison, I cannot undo what was done. The Confederacy that voted against humanity is already falling apart. Within a year, it will exist only in name. But I can help build something new. Something better. What are you proposing?" "A true partnership. Not the old system where ancient species make decisions and everyone else follows. A new alliance where every member has an equal voice. Where contribution matters more than age. Where species work together because they choose to, not because they have no other option." Kate studied his face for any sign of deception. She found none. Whatever else Zethrak might be, in this moment he was sincere. "Why should we trust you? Your people laughed at us. They called us weeds. Because I am not asking you to trust me. I am asking you to let me prove myself. Let me work beside you. Let me show that at least some of us can learn from our mistakes." The door to the room opened, and General Mira entered. Behind her came representatives from 8 other species who had already agreed to join humanity in a new alliance. They filed in silently, and took positions around the room. Captain Leo Grant was among them. He had come as a representative of ordinary humans, the cargo haulers and engineers and medics who did the real work of civilization. When Zethric saw him, he rose from his chair. "Captain Grant, I remember you from the Unity Summit records. You have served on trade routes for many years." Leo nodded. 15 years. Most of that time, I hauled cargo to worlds that did not even know my name. May I ask you something? Go ahead. Why did your people support the withdrawal? It must have caused hardship for many of you. Lost jobs, disrupted lives. Yet there were no protests. No demands to return to normal. Why? Leo looked at Kate, who nodded for him to speak freely. "Because we knew what we were worth," Leo said simply. "We knew that one day everyone else would see it too. And we were willing to suffer a little while so that day would come sooner." Zethrak stood very still as those words sank in. Then he turned back to Kate. "What do you want from us? What would it take to bring humanity back to the table?" Kate rose from her chair and walked to the window. The stars burned cold and distant in the darkness. "We do not want to come back to your table," she said. "We want to build a new one." She turned to face the room. "The Galactic Cooperative will be different from the Confederacy. There will be no permanent council seats. No species will have special privileges based on how long they have been members. Decisions will require consensus, not just majority votes. And anyone who wants to restrict another species simply because they are growing too fast will have to explain themselves to everyone else. You would have us start over completely? I would have us start over honestly. No more pretending that age equals wisdom. No more treating new species like children who need to be controlled. Just civilizations working together because cooperation benefits everyone." Zethric looked around the room at the representatives who had gathered. Kishari and Drenari and Thalarians and others. Species that had already chosen to side with humanity. Species that had seen the truth before he had. And the Vorians? What place would we have in this new order? The same place as everyone else. Equal partners with equal responsibilities. Kate walked toward him until they stood face to face. "Counselor, I will not lie to you. Many humans are angry. They remember the laughter and the insults and the vote that tried to cage us. It will take time to rebuild trust. I understand. But we are willing to try, because that is what humans do. We build things. We fix things. We bring people together even when they have every reason to stay apart." She extended her hand again. "Will you help us build something worth believing in?" Zethrak looked at her hand for a long moment. 300 years of leading the galaxy. 300 years of certainty that his way was the right way. All of it had led to this moment, standing in a small room on a tiny station, being offered a chance to start over. He reached out and took her hand. 1 year later, the old Nexus station was converted into a museum. The great chamber where the Unity Summit had been held was preserved exactly as it had been. A reminder of what the galaxy had almost lost to pride and fear. The new Galactic Cooperative held its meetings on a station that humans and aliens had built together. It was smaller than the Nexus, but it was alive with purpose. Species that had never spoken to each other now worked side by side. Old enemies discovered common ground. New alliances formed every day. Kate Morrison stood at a window in the cooperative headquarters and watched ships from a dozen worlds coming and going. Beside her stood Zethrak, no longer a counselor but simply an advisor who had chosen to dedicate his remaining years to making things right. "They said we abandoned the table," Kate murmured. "They watched in terror as we walked away. And now?" She smiled. "Now they understand. We did not abandon anything. We simply refused to sit at a table where we were not welcome. And in doing so, we made room for a better one." Outside the window, a human cargo ship passed alongside a Vorian transport. They flew in perfect formation, partners in a galaxy that had finally learned to see what had always been there. Humanity had never wanted to rule. They had only wanted to belong. And now, at last, they did. 1 month after humanity walked away from the Unity Summit, the Galactic Confederacy called an emergency session. It was the most important meeting in 300 years. It was also the emptiest. 12 species did not send representatives at all. They had already begun secret negotiations with humanity and saw no point in pretending otherwise. Another 8 sent only junior delegates with no authority to make decisions. The great chamber that had once held the voices of 47 civilizations now echoed with the silence of abandonment. Counselor Zephrek sat in his elevated seat and looked out at the scattered delegates who remained. His scales had lost some of their luster over the past month. His 4 eyes moved more slowly than they once had. For the first time in his long life, he looked old. "We must address the crisis," he said. His voice still carried authority, but there was something hollow underneath it now. Human withdrawal has caused disruptions across all sectors. We must find solutions. Trade Minister Kell rose to speak. He was young for a Vorian, barely 2 centuries old, and he had never agreed with the decision to restrict humanity. Now he stood before the council with anger burning in his eyes. "Solutions?" he repeated. "You speak of solutions as if this were a natural disaster. It is not. This is a wound we inflicted upon ourselves. We took a species that wanted nothing more than to help us, and we humiliated them. We laughed at them. We told them they were weeds that needed to be contained. You forget yourself," an elder Vorian warned. "We acted to protect the stability of the Confederacy. We acted out of fear and pride," Kell shot back. "And now look at what our fear and pride have cost us." He activated the central display and showed a map of the galaxy. Red marks appeared across every sector, each one representing a crisis that had emerged since the human withdrawal. Food shortages on 14 worlds. Medical emergencies on 23. Trade disruptions affecting over 60% of all commerce. Pirate activity up by 400%. And these are only the problems we know about. The chamber was silent. The humans did not cause any of this, Kell continued. They simply stopped preventing it. For 12 years, they quietly held our civilization together while we mocked them for their trouble. Now we see the truth. We needed them far more than they ever needed us. Meanwhile, on the human colony world of New Boston, Ambassador Kate Morrison watched the same reports with a very different expression. Boston was a green world of rolling hills and clear rivers. Humans had settled it 30 years ago and turned it into one of the most prosperous colonies in their territory. Kate had come here after the withdrawal to help coordinate the humanitarian response to the growing refugee crisis. Yes, refugees. Millions of beings from dozens of species were trying to reach human space. They came in cargo ships and passenger vessels, and sometimes in nothing more than modified escape pods. They came because human territory was the only stable region left in the galaxy. Admiral Sam Lawson stood beside Kate, watching the latest arrival statistics on a wall display. His expression was grim. "We cannot take them all," he said quietly. "We do not have the infrastructure." "We will find a way," Kate replied. "We always do." The irony is not lost on me. A month ago, they voted to contain us. Now they are begging us to let them in. Kate shook her head. The people coming here did not vote for anything. They are ordinary families who just want to be safe. We will not punish them for the sins of their leaders. She gave orders and human ships launched from a dozen worlds. They carried food and medicine and blankets and water purification systems. They distributed supplies to refugee camps regardless of species. Tholarians and Kishari and Drenari, and even a few Vorians all received the Same treatment. The galaxy watched this happen and did not know what to make of it. The humans had every reason to be angry. They had every right to turn the refugees away, or at least to demand something in return for their help. Instead, they gave freely to the same species that had tried to cage them. Kate gave a public address from New Boston that was broadcast across all Confederacy channels. She stood alone on a simple stage with no decorations and no flags. Just a woman speaking plainly to whoever would listen. For 12 years, humanity asked only to contribute. We built stations and repaired ships, and treated the sick and taught the young. We patrolled dangerous territory and mediated difficult disputes and worked jobs that no one else wanted. We did all of this because we believed in partnership. We believed that if we proved our worth, we would eventually be accepted as equals. She paused and let the silence stretch. We were wrong. You did not want partners. You wanted servants. You wanted us to work and sacrifice and never complain and never grow and never dream of anything more than the scraps you allowed us to have. When we dared to ask for respect, you laughed and voted to cage us. Our voice remained calm. There was no anger in it, only truth. So we left, not to punish you, but to show you what you had. And now you see it. Now you understand what humanity was actually doing while you dismissed us as primitive newcomers. Back at the Nexus station, Counselor Zethrak watched the broadcast alone in his private chambers. He had dismissed his attendants and guards because he did not want anyone to see his face as he listened. When the broadcast ended, he sat in darkness for a long time. Then he did something he had not done in 300 years. He accessed the historical archives and began reading. Not the official histories that celebrated Vorian achievements, but the small records. The daily reports, the maintenance logs, the medical files, the countless tiny documents that recorded the actual work of running a civilization. He read for hours. And with every file he opened, he found humans. Human engineers who fixed problems before anyone knew they existed. Human doctors who treated patients in remote locations where no one else would go. Human mediators who resolved conflicts that could have become wars. Thousands of them. Tens of thousands. All working quietly in the background while the great powers of the galaxy took credit for everything. When dawn came, Zethrak closed the archives and made a decision. He could not speak for the Confederacy. That institution was already dying. But he could speak for himself. He recorded a message and sent it to Ambassador Kate Morrison. It was not an official diplomatic communication. It was not a formal apology. It was simply an old leader asking a younger one if they could talk. The response came within the hour. Kate agreed to meet him at a neutral location in 3 days. For the first time in a month, Zethrak felt something that might have been hope. 2 weeks had passed since humanity abandoned the table, and the Galactic Confederacy was beginning to crack. The cracks were small at first. A trade dispute here. A territorial argument there. Species that had maintained polite relations for centuries suddenly found themselves unable to agree on anything. It turned out that human diplomats had been quietly mediating dozens of minor conflicts, smoothing over disagreements before they could grow into something larger. Without those mediators, old grievances surfaced like bodies rising from deep water. The Thalarians accused the Vorians of manipulating food prices. The Kishari demanded payment for military protection they had provided to border colonies. The Drenari threatened to withdraw from the Confederacy entirely unless their religious sites were given special protected status. Counselor Zethrak spent his days in meetings that went nowhere and his nights staring at reports that only brought bad news. He had ruled this council for 300 years. He had always found solutions. But this time, the problem was not something he could negotiate or threaten or outmaneuver. The problem was absence. And you cannot negotiate with absence. On a small Drenari world called Vetha Prime, a different kind of crisis was unfolding. The Drenari were a delicate species. Their translucent skin and fragile bodies made them vulnerable to diseases that other species shrugged off easily. 3 months ago, a plague had begun spreading through the population of Vetha Prime. The local doctors had tried everything, but the disease was too aggressive for their treatments. Human medical teams had arrived within days of the first outbreak. They had brought equipment and medicines, and most importantly, they had brought experience. Humans had survived plagues that killed 90% of their population. They knew how to fight diseases that seemed unstoppable. For 3 months, those human doctors had worked around the clock. They had developed a treatment protocol. They had trained local volunteers. They had slowly pushed the plague back from the edge of catastrophe. Then the withdrawal order came from Earth. And one by one, the human medical staff packed their bags and left. All except one. Nurse Ella Price was 34 years old. She had grown up in a small town in Kansas and had always dreamed of seeing the stars. When she finished her medical training, she had volunteered for the Confederacy aid programs that sent human healthcare workers to alien worlds. She had spent the last 2 years on Vetha Prime, and she had come to love the gentle Drenari people who lived there. When the withdrawal order came, Ella read it carefully and then deleted it from her communicator. She was not leaving. Not yet. Not while there were still patients who needed her. High Priest Varun found her in the medical center at dawn, 14 days after the last human ship had departed. She was sitting beside the bed of a young Drenari child, checking vital signs and adjusting medication levels. Dark circles surrounded her eyes. Her hands trembled slightly from exhaustion. But she was still there. Vor Yuan was ancient, even by Drenari standards. His skin was so thin that you could see the slow pulse of his heart through his chest. He had served as the spiritual leader of Vetha Prime for longer than Ella had been alive. He had seen many things in his long life, but he had never seen anything quite like this human woman who refused to leave. "You should be gone," he said softly. "Your people have abandoned us. Why do you remain?" Ella did not look up from her patient. "My people did not abandon you. Your leaders pushed us out. They voted to restrict us. They laughed at us. They treated us like pests that needed to be controlled. And yet you stay. I stay because this child did not vote against humanity. Her parents did not laugh at us. The sick and the scared and the dying are not responsible for the arrogance of politicians." She finally looked up at him with eyes that burned with something Varun could not quite identify. "That is what humans do, High Priest. We separate the innocent from the guilty. We help those who need help, even when their leaders do not deserve it." Varun stood in silence for a long moment. Then he lowered himself carefully into a chair beside her. "Teach me," he said. "Teach me what you know. I am old and slow, but I can learn." Ella smiled for the first time in days. "That is all I ever wanted. Someone willing to learn." Across the galaxy, the situation continued to deteriorate. Pirates had discovered that the trade routes were no longer protected. Raiders struck at cargo convoys that once would have had human escorts. Entire shipments of food and medicine disappeared into the void. The Confederacy tried to fill the gaps with their own patrol vessels, but there were not enough of them. Human ships had covered territory that no other species wanted to touch. The dangerous routes. The lonely routes. The routes that took you far from help and kept you there for months at a time. Humans had volunteered for those assignments because humans could handle the isolation. Their minds were built to endure loneliness in ways that other species could not match. A Thalarian went mad after 3 weeks alone. A Kishari needed the presence of their pack to stay stable. But a human could spend a year in the black emptiness of space and come home still sane. That was the thing the Confederacy had never understood. Humans were not just useful because of what they could do. They were useful because of what they could endure. Counselor Zethrak finally swallowed his pride and attempted to contact Earth through official diplomatic channels. The response came within hours. It was polite. It was formal. And it offered nothing. The message stated that humanity would be happy to discuss returning to the Confederacy once they received a formal apology and official recognition of their contributions to galactic society. Until then, all human citizens would remain within their own territory, and all human services would be suspended. Zethrak. Read the message 3 times. An apology. They wanted him to apologize. The leader of the greatest civilization in the galaxy, apologizing to a species that had only discovered faster than light travel 2 centuries ago. He threw the message across the room in a fit of rage that surprised even himself. But while he fumed, other species were making different calculations. The Kishari had always respected human warriors. The Drenari remembered the human doctors who had saved their people. Even some of the younger Vorians had begun to question whether their elders had made a terrible mistake. A Pari, secret Kishari delegation traveled to human space to discuss a separate alliance. Word of this leaked to the Confederacy within days. The cracks were getting larger, and Counselor Zethrak was beginning to understand a terrible truth. The humans had not destroyed anything. They had simply stepped back and allowed everyone to see what they had been holding together all along. 3 days passed after the human delegation walked out of the Unity Summit. The Confederacy leadership spent those 3 days telling themselves that it meant nothing. Humans were emotional creatures. Everyone knew that. They would calm down and return with apologies, and everything would go back to normal. Director Yenix was the first to notice that things were not going back to normal. He was a Tholarian administrator who managed one of the largest trading hubs in the eastern sectors. His compound eyes could track hundreds of data streams at once, and he had been watching trade patterns for over 60 years. He knew the rhythm of commerce the way a musician knows the rhythm of a song. And right now, something was very wrong with the rhythm. The atmospheric processors had not arrived. This might seem like a small thing, but it was not. Tholarian agricultural stations floated in the upper atmospheres of gas giants where they grew food for billions of beings. Those stations needed constant maintenance, and the processors that kept the air breathable were manufactured almost exclusively by humans. No other species had figured out how to make them so cheaply and so reliably. Yenix sent a message to the shipping company. The response came back within an hour. Human cargo vessels were no longer servicing Confederacy routes. All contracts had been suspended pending further notice. He sent messages to 3 other shipping companies. He received the same response from all of them. The humans were gone, across the galaxy. Similar discoveries were being made. A Vorian hospital realized that their human surgical consultants had quietly resigned and returned to Earth. Kishari Military Academy found that their human combat instructors had departed without explanation. A Drenari research station noticed that their human engineers had packed their belongings and left in the night. No one had been rude about it. No one had caused any trouble. They had simply left. Thousands of humans across hundreds of worlds, all leaving at the same time, as if following some silent signal that only they could hear. Captain Leo Grant was one of the last to go. He commanded the cargo vessel, Steady Horizon, a reliable ship that had been hauling freight between systems for 15 years. His current route took him to a Kishari colony world on the edge of explored space, and he intended to complete his final delivery before heading home. The colony was called Far Harbor, and it sat on a cold world of ice and stone. The Kishari who lived there had built their settlement inside a massive cave system where hot springs kept the temperature bearable. They were tough people who had chosen a hard life far from the comforts of the core worlds. General, Mira was waiting at the landing pad when Leo brought his ship down. She was tall for a Kishari, with silver-streaked fur that marked her age and experience. Her yellow eyes watched Leo carefully as he supervised the unloading of supplies. "Captain Grant," she said when the work was nearly finished, "I would speak with you." Leo nodded and followed her to a quiet corner of the landing bay. The cold air bit at his exposed skin, but he ignored it. Humans had lived through ice ages. A little chill was nothing. "What is happening?" Mira asked directly. The Kishari were not a species that wasted time on small talk. "Your people are leaving. All of them. Everywhere. No explanation. No warning." Leo had known this question would come. He had thought about how to answer it during the long journey here. "Your council voted to cage us," he said simply. "They laughed at us when we tried to explain our value. They called us weeds that needed to be contained." Mara's ears flattened against her head. "I voted against that motion. The Kishari have always respected humanity. I know, and I respect you for it. But it was not enough." The message was clear. The Confederacy does not want human partnership. They want human labor without human voices. They want us to build and heal and protect, but never to grow or speak or dream. So you abandon us all? Even those who supported you? Leo shook his head. We abandoned nothing. We simply stopped giving ourselves to those who do not want us. You wanted to know what the galaxy looks like without humans. Now you will find out. He finished supervising the cargo transfer and returned to his ship. Before he sealed the hatch, he turned back to look at Mira one last time. "For what it is worth, General, I hope we meet again. The Kishari have always been good to us. I will remember that." The steady horizon lifted off and disappeared into the gray sky. Mira stood alone on the landing pad for a long time afterward, thinking about what she had heard. Back at the Nexus station, the Confederacy was holding emergency meetings that accomplished nothing. The Vorians insisted that the humans would return once they realized how much they needed Confederacy protection. Other species were not so sure. Reports flooded in from every corner of the galaxy. Mining operations had slowed because human engineers had kept the equipment running. Medical facilities were struggling because human doctors had treated patients that other species considered too difficult or too unimportant. Communication networks were developing gaps because human technicians had maintained relay stations in remote and dangerous locations. None of this had been secret. Everyone had known that humans did these things. But no one had realized how much of it there was. Humans had made themselves useful in 10,000 small ways, and now every single one of those ways was a hole that needed to be filled. The worst part was the defense patrols. Human military vessels had protected trade routes through dangerous territory for years. They had asked for nothing in return except the right to exist peacefully alongside other species. Now those vessels had pulled back to a defensive perimeter around Earth and its colonies. The formation was perfect. Every ship positioned exactly where it needed to be for maximum coverage. It was not aggressive. The weapons were not armed. The ships made no threatening moves, but somehow that made it worse. This was not a fleet preparing for war. This was a civilization building walls. And everyone who looked at those walls understood the same truth. The humans were not coming back. Not until something changed. Counselor Zethrak received a report on the fourth day that made his scales go pale. 3 Confederacy worlds that depended heavily on human agricultural support were reporting food shortages. The warehouses had reserves for perhaps 2 months. After that, people would start to go hungry. He had thought the humans were bluffing. He had thought they were playing politics. He had been wrong. This was not a negotiating tactic. This was a demonstration. And the lesson it taught was simple and terrible. The galaxy had never noticed how much it needed humanity. Now it would notice nothing else. The Nexus station floated at the center of known space like a jewel made of metal and light. It was the largest structure ever built by the Galactic Confederacy, and it served as the meeting place for all species who had earned a seat at the council table. Every year, representatives from 47 different worlds gathered here for the Unity Summit to discuss trade and territory and the future of civilization itself. Ambassador Kate Morrison stood at the entrance to the great chamber and took a deep breath. She had been doing this job for 6 years now, and she still felt small whenever she walked into this room. The ceiling rose so high that clouds sometimes formed near the top. The walls were lined with the flags of every member species, and somewhere near the back, almost hidden behind the others, hung the blue and white banner of Earth. Humanity had only been part of the Confederacy for 12 years. In galactic terms, that was barely a single heartbeat. Most of the other species had been members for centuries or even thousands of years. They looked at humans the way adults might look at children who had wandered into an important meeting by accident. Kate walked to her designated seat and nodded to Admiral Sam Lawson, who sat beside her as the military representative of the human delegation. Sam was a quiet man with gray hair and calm eyes. He rarely spoke during these meetings, but he watched everything and forgot nothing. The chamber filled slowly as delegates from dozens of worlds took their places. There were the Thalarians with their compound eyes and clicking mandibles. There were the Kishari with their golden fur and sharp teeth. There were the Drenari with their tall bodies and skin so pale you could almost see through it. And at the center of the raised platform sat the Vorians, the oldest and most powerful species in the Confederacy. Counselor Zethrak was their leader. He had 4 arms and scales the color of dark emeralds, and he had been guiding the Confederacy for longer than humanity had possessed space travel. When he spoke, everyone listened. When he voted, others followed. The session began with minor matters: trade disputes between neighboring systems, resource allocation for frontier colonies, maintenance schedules for the hyperspace relay network. Kate sat through all of it patiently, knowing that the real business would come later. It came 3 hours into the meeting when Zethrak rose from his seat and activated the central display. A map of the galaxy appeared, with human territories marked in blue. "We must address a growing concern," Zethrak said. His voice was deep, and it echoed through the chamber. Human expansion into the Outer Rim territories has accelerated beyond acceptable parameters. I propose Motion 7742, which would place restrictions on further human colonization until a proper assessment can be completed. Kate felt her stomach tighten, but she kept her face calm. She had expected something like this. The other species had been making nervous comments about human growth for years. Now she stood and requested permission to speak. Zethrak granted it with a wave of one of his 4 hands. "Honored council members," Kate began, "I understand the concerns about expansion. Change can be frightening, especially when it happens quickly. But I would ask you to consider what human colonies have actually accomplished in the Outer Rim." She activated her own display and showed images of barren worlds that have been transformed into thriving ecosystems. She showed trade statistics that proved human settlements had increased commerce for everyone. She showed medical advances that human researchers had shared freely with all species. "We are not taking from the galaxy," Kate said. "We are adding to it. Every world we settle becomes a partner for trade and cooperation. Every station we build is open to all species. We ask only for the chance to contribute." She sat down. The chamber was silent for a moment. Then a Thalarian delegate made a clicking sound that the translator rendered as laughter. "The young species asks for a chance to contribute," he said. "How generous of them to offer what we never requested." More laughter followed. A Vorian delegate on the lower platform spoke next. Perhaps if humans spent less time breeding and more time developing proper culture, they would not need to spread across the galaxy like weeds. Kate felt Sam stiffen beside her, but she placed a hand on his arm to keep him calm. The debate continued for another hour. A few species spoke in defense of humanity. General Mira of the Kashari argued that human soldiers had fought bravely alongside her people during the border conflicts. A Drenari priest mentioned that human doctors had helped contain a plague on his homeworld. But their voices were drowned out by the majority. When the vote came, it was not even close. Motion 7742 passed with 31 votes in favor and only 9 against. Human expansion would be frozen indefinitely, pending a review that everyone knew would never actually happen. Kate sat very still as the results were announced. She had prepared herself for this possibility, but the reality of it still hurt. 12 years of work. 12 years of proving humanity's worth. And it meant nothing to them. Her personal communicator vibrated silently. She glanced down and saw an encrypted message from Earth with the highest priority code. She opened it and read the contents twice to make sure she understood. Something shifted in her expression. Sam noticed it immediately. He leaned close and whispered, "What is it?" Kate did not answer. Instead, she slowly gathered her documents and placed them in her case. She straightened her jacket and stood up. The chamber continued with its business. No one paid attention to her at first. Why would they? The human ambassador was just a minor figure in a room full of ancient powers. "Counselor Zethrak," Kate said. Her voice was not loud, but something in its tone made the room go quiet. "I must inform the Council that the human delegation is withdrawing from this summit effective immediately." Silence fell like a hammer. Zethrak's 4 eyes blinked in confusion. "Ambassador Morrison, I do not understand. Withdrawal from the Unity Summit is unprecedented." "Yes," Kate said simply. "It is. Surely you cannot be serious. Over a single vote? This is childish behavior unbecoming of a Confederacy member." Kate looked at him steadily. "We did not come here to be mocked. We did not come here to be dismissed. We came here to be partners. You have made it clear that you do not want partners. You want servants who should be grateful for whatever scraps you allow them." She walked toward the exit. Sam followed her without hesitation. "You have made your position clear," Kate said without turning around. "Now you will see ours." As she reached the door, every screen in the station flickered and went dark. For 3 seconds, the most advanced diplomatic facility in the galaxy was completely blind. Then the systems returned to normal as if nothing had happened. But everyone in that chamber knew that something had happened. Something had changed. Counselor Zethrak sat in his elevated seat and stared at the door through which the humans had disappeared. He had led the Confederacy for 300 years. He had navigated wars and plagues and economic collapses. He had always known what to do next. For the first time in 300 years, he had no idea what would happen now.